On a sunny morning in Mexico City, Roberto and Mariana's family seems to live in perfect harmony, but a silent storm is brewing in the heart of their daughter, Luisa. The mansion where they live is a symbol of prosperity and success, but Luisa is no longer satisfied with what she has. Luisa had always had everything a girl could want. From a young age, she grew up surrounded by expensive toys, trips abroad, and the best education in the most prestigious schools. Her parents, Roberto and Mariana, loved her deeply, but firmly believed that hard work was the only way to achieve success. And although Luisa had learned the importance of effort, her desire to obtain more grew day by day. What once seemed like a dream life was no longer enough to fill the emptiness I felt. Roberto was the owner of a large construction company, an empire that he had built from scratch with effort and sacrifice. He had always been a rigid but fair man who believed that one day Luisa would inherit the company if she showed responsibility and dedication. Mariana, on the other hand, was the perfect balance for her husband. Intelligent and sensitive, she tried to maintain harmony in the family, but lately she noticed that something was wrong with Luisa. The conversations were shorter, her daughter's smiles were forced, and the hugs were increasingly rare. Mariana knew that something was changing. Luisa, now 25, felt trapped. Working in his father's company was no longer a privilege, but an obligation. He saw how Roberto still controlled every detail of the company, refusing to give up any significant responsibility. This filled her with resentment. I wanted more. She wanted to be recognized not only as the daughter of the owner, but as the true heir to that empire. However, it seemed that her parents still saw her as a child, and that perception was beginning to corrode her relationship with them. That morning, Luisa received a message from Miguel, her lifelong friend. Miguel was a charming, attractive, and ambitious man. He came from a simple family, but his thirst for power had made him a ruthless being. Luisa had always been attracted to him, not only because of his appearance, but because of his cunning intelligence. Miguel knew how to get what he wanted, and that fascinated her. In recent months, he had planted an idea in Luisa's mind, a dangerous but tempting idea. What if she took what was hers, instead of patiently waiting for her parents' approval? Why are you still waiting, Luisa? You know you're entitled to that fortune. You're smarter than your father, but he'll never see it. If you don't act now, all this will fade away, Miguel had told her in one of their recent meetings. His voice was soft, but loaded with a sweet poison that infiltrated Luisa's insecurities. She shook her head, trying to push those thoughts away, but she couldn't deny the truth.
I felt that Miguel was right.
He worked hard, more than many of those in important positions of the company, but he never received the credit. His ideas were ignored, his suggestions discarded. Roberto always made the final decisions, and most of the time, he didn't even listen to what Luisa had to say. That morning, while she was having breakfast with her parents, the feeling of frustration grew inside her. The mansion was silent, save for the soft clink of porcelain as her mother poured coffee. Roberto read the newspaper, oblivious to the tension in the air, while Mariana watched her daughter with concern in her eyes. "How are things going in the office, Luisa?" Mariana asked, trying to start a conversation. "Good, Mom. Everything remains the same," Luisa replied, with a cold tone that did not go unnoticed by her mother. Roberto, without looking up from the newspaper, added, "I've been thinking that we could expand to other cities. It's a good time to diversify. What do you think, daughters?" Luisa felt her stomach churn. Even when Roberto tried to include her in decisions, he never really considered her opinions. He knew that no matter what he said, he already had everything planned in his head. "Yes, Dad, it might be a good idea," Luisa replied, without interest. Roberto muttered something in agreement, paying no attention to his daughter's answer, and plunged back into the newspaper. Mariana sensed Luisa's discomfort, but she did not know how to approach the subject. Something inside Luisa was changing, and the mother could feel the growing distance. After breakfast, Luisa received a message from Miguel. "See you in an hour. I have something important to tell you." He quickly finished his coffee, got up, and, without much explanation, left the house. Mariana watched her leave with growing concern. He felt that there was something more behind that sudden coldness, but he still couldn't identify what it was. Luisa drove through the busy streets of Mexico City, feeling a mixture of anxiety and excitement. Miguel always had a plan. He always knew how to move the pieces on the board. And this time, I was ready to hear what he had to say. When she arrived at the place of the meeting, a discreet cafe in the center of the city, Miguel was already waiting for her. He smiled when he saw her and got up to receive her with a kiss on the cheek. "You look beautiful, as always," he said, with that irresistible charm of his. "I'm not in the mood for compliments, Miguel. What did you want to tell me?" He invited her to sit down and, with a serious look, began to lay out his plan. Miguel believed that Luisa was being underestimated by her parents and that she had every right to take control of the family fortune. He suggested that he start siphoning small amounts of money away from the company, something discreet enough that no one would notice at first. "It's just the beginning, Luisa. If you do it right, you could be in absolute control in no time. And when your father realizes it, it will be too late to reverse it." Luisa listened attentively, her heart beating faster. The idea seemed crazy, but at the same time, it was exactly what I wanted to hear. For the first time, he felt that he could have the power he had always wanted. His face reflected a mixture of fear and excitement. "What if they discover me, Miguel? I could lose everything. Not if you do it intelligently. You know the company better than anyone. You know where the gaps are. You just have to take advantage of them." Luisa's gaze hardened. I knew that, once I started, there would be no turning back. She was about to cross a line, but as she looked at Miguel, she felt that he was the only one who understood her, the only one who saw her true value. "It's all right," Luisa said finally, in a firm voice. "I will." The decision was made. Luisa would begin her plan of betrayal, but she did not yet know the devastating consequences that her actions would have for her family and for herself. After her meeting with Miguel, Luisa feels more determined than ever to carry out her plan. Her parents' mansion is still her home, but now it also feels like a prison from which she wants to escape. As the days pass, Luisa begins to execute her first steps, sowing the seeds of betrayal in secret while maintaining a facade of normalcy. The morning sun streamed through the large windows of her parents' house, but inside Luisa, there was darkness. In the days that followed her conversation with Miguel, Luisa couldn't stop thinking about the plan. Every time she looked at her parents, every time she entered the family business office, she felt a mix of guilt and excitement. It was as if she were living two lives at once. On one hand, the obedient, responsible daughter, and on the other, the cunning strategist ready to dismantle everything her parents had built. Luisa spent more time at the office than ever before. She made sure that everyone saw her as a committed worker. She arrived early, reviewed documents, attended meetings, and suggested small changes that seemed harmless, but were actually starting to lay the groundwork for her big move. She knew she couldn't rush. She had to be careful, meticulous. Once she started siphoning money, there would be no turning back. "You need to be patient," Miguel had told her. "If you move too fast, your parents will suspect. Do it little by little. No one will pay attention to small amounts at first." Every night, after long days at the office, Luisa would sit in her room, going over the numbers again and again. She had studied the company's financial statements until she knew every detail. She knew where the weak points were, the gaps she could exploit without anyone noticing. And so, slowly, she began to execute her plan. The first step was opening a secret account in an international bank. She knew she couldn't use any local bank. Her parents had connections everywhere, and one wrong move could expose her. Miguel had recommended a bank in the Cayman Islands, a place where money could be hidden without a trace. Luisa felt nervous making the initial transfer, but when she saw the money move smoothly, she felt a strange sense of relief. It was as if she had crossed a line she never imagined she would, but instead of regret, she felt power. At first, she only diverted small amounts. 100,000 pesos here, 200,000 there. Just enough to go unnoticed. Her father's empire generated so much money that these amounts seemed insignificant in comparison. Besides, Luisa was smart enough to cover her tracks. Every transfer was disguised as operating expenses or payments to fictitious suppliers that only existed in the internal balance sheets. Days passed, and Luisa felt more confident. Every time she saw her father review the financial reports, her heart raced a little faster, but Roberto never noticed anything out of the ordinary. Everything seemed to be in order. Sometimes, when Mariana asked how things were going at the office, Luisa would smile and respond with a calmness that surprised even her. "Everything's going well, Mom. The business is growing as always." Mariana nodded, pleased that her daughter was finally more involved in the family business. To her, Luisa was doing exactly what she had always hoped, following in her father's footsteps and becoming an integral part of the empire. But what Mariana didn't know was that her daughter was walking in a completely different direction, one that would lead her away from the family forever. One day, while Luisa was working at the office, she received a call from Miguel. "How's everything going?" he asked, his voice soft but full of curiosity. "It's going well. No one has noticed anything yet," Luisa replied as she looked at her computer screen, where the numbers danced before her eyes. "I knew you could do it. Just keep going, and soon it will all be yours." Miguel's words reassured her, but at the same time, there was something in his tone that unsettled her. Despite their close relationship, Luisa knew that Miguel had his own interests. He had always been driven by money and power, and although he said he wanted to help her, Luisa couldn't help but wonder if he would betray her at some point as well. But she kept that doubt to herself. She needed Miguel at that moment, and she couldn't afford to distrust him. As the days passed, Luisa began to take more risks. The amounts of money she diverted gradually increased, but they were still small enough to go unnoticed. However, as her plan progressed, so did the tension at home. Mariana began to notice small changes in her daughter. Luisa seemed more distant, colder. She no longer sat down to talk with her parents after work, and when she did, her answers were brief, almost mechanical. "Luisa, are you okay? You seem a bit distant lately," Mariana commented one night, as the two were in the kitchen. "Yes, Mom, I'm just tired. Work has been intense." Mariana looked at her for a moment, trying to decipher what was really going on. She knew there was something more, something her daughter wasn't telling her, but she didn't want to push. After all, Luisa was busy with the business, and Mariana thought maybe it was just the stress of work. Meanwhile, Roberto continued to trust his daughter blindly. To him, Luisa was finally proving that she had what it took to run the family business. Every time she presented a report or proposal, Roberto praised her, unaware that behind that facade of efficiency and dedication, his daughter was dismantling everything he had built. But despite everything, Luisa couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt now and then. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if what she was doing was really worth it. Did she really want to destroy her family for money? Was that what would make her happy? But every time those doubts arose, Miguel's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her that power and independence were more important than anything else. One morning, as she was reviewing the latest financial reports at her office, Luisa received an unexpected call from her mother. "Luisa, could you come home this afternoon? Your father, and I want to talk to you." Luisa's heart raced. Had they discovered something? Did they know what she was doing? Trying to stay calm, she responded, "Sure, Mom. I'll be there after work." The rest of the day passed in a fog of nerves. Although Luisa had covered her tracks, she couldn't help but feel vulnerable. She knew that if her parents found out what she was doing, there would be no turning back. Her life would change forever. But at the same time, part of her was excited by the challenge. She was playing a dangerous game, and though the risk was high, so was the reward. When she arrived home that afternoon, her parents were waiting for her in the living room. Roberto had a serious expression, while Mariana looked more worried than angry. "Luisa, we need to talk to you about something important," Roberto said, his voice firm but calm. Luisa took a deep breath, preparing for the worst. The tension in the air was palpable. Luisa sat down in front of her parents, her mind racing in all directions. Would this be the moment when her entire plan collapsed, or could she continue with her betrayal without being discovered? After her day at the office, Luisa arrives home, where her parents are waiting for a serious conversation. Although she fears she has been discovered, what Roberto and Mariana tell her is completely unexpected, giving her the perfect opportunity to advance her plan. Luisa walked into the house, her heart racing. In the living room, Roberto and Mariana were waiting for her, both with serious expressions. The silence was heavy, and Luisa couldn't shake the feeling that they had finally figured out what she was doing. She tried to stay calm as she sat down in front of them. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Roberto cleared his throat before speaking. "We've been thinking it's time for you to take on more responsibilities in the company." Luisa looked at him in surprise. She hadn't expected that. For years, she had waited for her father to take her seriously, to give her the control she believed she deserved. This was the moment she had been anticipating, the opportunity to speed up her plan. If she gained more power, she could divert more money without raising suspicion. "Of course," Roberto continued, "but first, there are a few irregularities I'd like to review with you. Nothing major, but there are some expenses that don't seem to have been approved." Luisa felt a wave of panic, but quickly regained her composure. She knew Roberto had noticed small discrepancies in the financial reports, but she also knew that the amounts she had siphoned so far were too small to cause alarm. She just needed to stay calm. "Irregularities?" she asked, raising an eyebrow as if surprised. "I haven't noticed anything unusual, but I'll review it tomorrow." Roberto watched her for a moment, as if trying to read her expression, but finally nodded. "All right. I trust you'll sort it out." Mariana chimed in with a comforting smile. "We know you can handle it, honey. We just want to make sure everything is in order." Luisa smiled, relieved that the conversation hadn't escalated. She knew that, from this point forward, she would have to be even more careful. While everything seemed under control, any small mistake could ruin everything. The following days were crucial for Luisa. Now, with more control in the company, she was able to divert larger sums of money without arousing suspicion. It was no longer about small amounts. She was now transferring millions to her secret offshore account. Every transaction made her feel more powerful, but she knew the risks were growing. Miguel continued advising her, guiding her every step. She knew that as her plan progressed, Miguel's support was essential. Although she sometimes doubted his true intentions, she couldn't afford to distrust him at this point. They had come too far, and success depended on pressing forward. One afternoon, as she reviewed the latest financial balances, Luisa decided it was time to make her first bold move. Through a complex web of accounts and transactions, she managed to divert a significant amount of money into her secret account. This time, it wasn't just a few 100,000 pesos. This time, she had transferred millions. Sitting in front of her computer, she watched the transfer complete. 1 million pesos. She knew she had crossed a new line, and although part of her was terrified of the potential consequences, another part of her was thrilled by the possibility of finally getting what she had always wanted. That night, during dinner with her parents, Luisa couldn't help but feel a growing unease. Roberto was looking at her in a strange way, as if he suspected something wasn't right. Although he hadn't said anything concrete, Luisa could sense that something had changed. "How's everything going at the office?" Roberto asked suddenly. Luisa tensed slightly, but smiled as she answered. "Everything's fine. I've been going over the reports like you asked." Roberto nodded slowly, but didn't continue the conversation. The silence at the table was uncomfortable. Mariana, unaware of the tension, continued serving dinner, trying to keep things normal. Luisa knew she was playing a dangerous game. Although she had successfully siphoned off a large sum of money, she knew she couldn't let her guard down. Roberto wasn't a fool, and if he noticed anything out of place, her entire plan could fall apart. As dinner continued, Luisa realized that her first big move had been a success, but her father's looks suggested that things wouldn't be so easy from now on. Her next step would have to be even more cautious. After her first big strike, Luisa begins to feel that things are changing. The tension at home is growing more palpable, and although Roberto still hasn't uncovered anything concrete, Luisa senses that time is running out. Instead of stopping, however, she chooses to press on, driven by both her ambition and her fear of being caught. The weeks that followed the diversion of millions of pesos were a mix of euphoria and paranoia for Luisa. On one hand, she felt the power of controlling a hidden fortune, far from the watchful eyes of her father. Every time she checked her offshore account, a thrill of satisfaction ran through her. She had achieved what many would not even dare to dream, and she had done it right under everyone's nose. But on the other hand, the fear of being discovered consumed her. She knew Roberto wasn't easy to fool. He had built his company with a firm hand and didn't let even the smallest error slip by. The tension at home was becoming increasingly noticeable. With every step she took, Luisa felt like she was walking a tightrope, with an abyss of consequences waiting below. That morning, while having breakfast with her parents, Luisa could barely concentrate on the conversation. Roberto was distracted by the newspaper, as usual, but Mariana was watching her with those motherly eyes that seemed to see everything. Luisa felt that her mother knew something was wrong, even if she couldn't prove it. Every time Mariana asked about her work, Luisa responded with monosyllables, avoiding going into detail. She knew that any slip could be fatal. "How are things at the office, dear?" Mariana asked in her usual kind tone. "Fine, Mom. Everything's the same." Mariana studied her in silence for a few seconds, as if wanting to say something more, but eventually just nodded, letting the subject drop. Luisa sighed with relief. However, she knew she couldn't relax for long. Later that day at the office, Luisa locked herself in her office. Her plan had worked so far, but with each passing day, her father's inquisitive looks were becoming more frequent. She needed to move quickly, but also carefully. One wrong move, and everything would collapse. She stared at her computer screen, the numbers glowing in front of her. There was still more money to siphon, but something held her back. She felt like she was playing with fire. At that moment, her phone vibrated. It was Miguel. "How's everything going?" he asked in his usual confident tone. "Fine, I think," Luisa replied, not entirely convinced. "Roberto is starting to ask too many questions. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up without him noticing." Miguel chuckled softly on the other end of the line. "Your father won't find out anything if you follow my advice. We've come too far to stop now. You just have to stick to the plan." Luisa closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Miguel always had a way of reassuring her, but lately, his words didn't have the same effect. She knew Miguel was pushing her to keep going, but she was starting to wonder if he really cared about what happened to her, or if he was just interested in the money. "I don't know, Miguel. I feel like this could go wrong." "Trust me," Miguel insisted. "You're just one step away. If you do this right, you'll walk away with everything, and your father won't have a clue about what happened." That afternoon, Luisa felt trapped. She knew she had to act, but the fear of being discovered was paralyzing her. As she reviewed the company's financial records, she noticed some irregularities that she hadn't been able to fully cover up. They were small, but if Roberto decided to investigate them more closely, they could be enough to expose her. She decided to act immediately. She prepared a series of falsified documents that would justify the suspicious transactions and made sure to file them in places her father rarely checked. As she did this, her mind raced in 1,000 directions. Every step she took seemed to push her closer to the edge of a cliff. Hours later, well into the night, she returned home exhausted. But instead of feeling safe, the atmosphere at home was charged with a tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Roberto was in his office, as usual, reviewing company documents. Mariana was reading a book in the living room, but looked up when Luisa walked in. "You're home late," her mother commented, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, I had to stay late to review some reports," Luisa replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "Is everything all right?" Mariana insisted, her eyes conveying that she wasn't satisfied with a vague answer. "Everything's fine, Mom. It's just a lot of work." Mariana nodded slowly, but her eyes still held concern. Luisa knew her mother wasn't convinced, but for now, she seemed willing to let it go. That night, as Luisa tried to sleep, her mind wouldn't stop spinning. She knew she had come too far to turn back. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's face when he eventually discovered what she had done. She knew that day was approaching, but She wasn't ready to face it yet. She still needed to deliver that final blow, the one that would allow her to escape with everything before anyone noticed. But as the clock ticked and the night grew darker, Luisa began to wonder if it was all worth it. She had put everything on the line. Her relationship with her family, her integrity, her future. Could she really get away with it? Or would it all crumble around her? As the night dragged on, Luisa realized that the end of her plan was near, but so was the abyss she had been avoiding. The next move would have to be the most decisive and the most dangerous. Just one more step, but that step could cost her everything. After weeks of tension, Mariana begins to notice more signs that something is wrong. The concern she's always had for her daughter becomes a stronger suspicion. Meanwhile, Luisa continues with her plan, unaware that her mother is getting closer to uncovering the truth. Weeks had gone by, and Mariana couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Luisa's evasive answers, her emotional distance, the nights she spent at the office, something didn't add up. As a mother, she had learned to read the subtle signs in her daughter's behavior, and what she saw now disturbed her deeply. The tension in the house had become a constant presence, like a shadow following them with every step. Mariana remembered the times when Luisa had been open and trusting, when breakfast conversations flowed naturally. But now, everything felt different. Luisa always seemed defensive, always on edge, as if she were hiding something. Roberto didn't seem to notice as much as she did, but Mariana was determined to get to the bottom of it. That morning, while Roberto was at the office, Mariana decided to do something she had never done before: search through her daughter's things. She knew crossing this line was risky, but her instincts told her something was very wrong. When Luisa left for work, Mariana went into her room. The room was tidy, almost too perfect. Something about that perfection only added to her unease. She went through the desk drawers, looking for anything that might give her a clue as to what was going on. Finally, in a drawer tucked away at the bottom, she found a folder containing financial documents. Mariana didn't fully understand all the details, but something about the papers alarmed her. There were transactions she didn't recognize, large sums of money that didn't match up with what she knew about the family business. Mariana sat on the bed, holding the papers in her hands, her heart racing. She wasn't an expert in finances, but she knew enough to realize that something was very wrong. What was Luisa doing? Why had she hidden these documents? Questions flooded her mind, and the concern she had felt before transformed into certainty. Her daughter was involved in something dangerous. That afternoon, when Luisa came home, Mariana tried to act normal. She didn't want to confront her daughter until she was sure about what she had discovered. During dinner, the conversation was awkward, with long silences interrupted by short comments about work and the company. Roberto, as usual, seemed absorbed in his own thoughts, oblivious to the growing tension between his wife and daughter. "How was your day at the office?" Mariana asked, breaking the silence. "Fine, Mom, the usual," Luisa replied, staring at her plate, avoiding eye contact. Mariana felt a pang in her chest. She couldn't believe her own daughter was lying to her so blatantly, but she knew she couldn't accuse her without clearer evidence. She needed more time to investigate, to fully understand what was happening. After dinner, as Roberto went up to his office, Mariana decided to subtly confront Luisa. "Luisa, we've noticed you've been a bit distant lately. Are you all right?" Luisa looked up, surprised by the question. "Yeah, Mom, it's just work. You know how it is." Mariana nodded, but she wasn't satisfied with the answer. "You know you can tell me anything, right? If something is worrying you, I'm fine really. Don't worry so much." Luisa's voice was cold, almost mechanical, as if she were reciting a rehearsed response. Mariana said nothing more, but her suspicion only grew. She knew Luisa was hiding something big, and she wouldn't rest until she found out what it was. The next morning, while Luisa was at the office, Mariana decided to investigate further. She went to Roberto's office, where he kept the company's records, and began to go through the financial reports. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but something inside her pushed her to keep digging. And that's when she saw it. One of the reports showed a series of suspicious transactions, similar to the ones she had seen in Luisa's papers. They were significant sums, moved from one account to another without a clear explanation. Mariana's heart raced. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Luisa was siphoning money from the family business. The discovery left her frozen. She couldn't believe her daughter was capable of something like this. How had Luisa come to this point? What had driven her to betray her own family in such a way? Mariana's emotions fluctuated between disbelief and pain. She knew she couldn't keep ignoring what she had found. She had to confront Luisa, but how could she do it without completely destroying their relationship? That night, Mariana waited for Roberto to go to bed before seeking out Luisa in the living room. The moment had come. "Luisa, I need to talk to you," Mariana said, her tone soft but firm. Luisa, who was sitting on the couch looking at her phone, glanced up in surprise. "What is it about?" Mariana took a deep breath before continuing. "Today, I went through some company reports, and I found something I don't understand. There are transactions that don't seem to be in order." Luisa's face immediately hardened. She knew exactly what her mother was referring to, but she couldn't let Mariana find out everything. "Why were you looking through those reports?" Luisa asked, trying to sound calm, though her voice wavered slightly. "Because I'm worried about you, honey. I feel like something is happening, something you're not telling me. And what I saw today only increased my suspicions." Luisa stared at her mother in silence for a moment, trying to think of what to say. She knew she was cornered, but she couldn't admit it, not yet. "Mom, I don't know what you think you've seen, but I assure you everything is fine." Mariana shook her head, tears beginning to well in her eyes. "No, Luisa, not everything is fine. I can feel it. And now I know you're hiding something from me. Please tell me the truth." The silence that followed was heavy. Luisa looked at her mother, feeling a mix of guilt and anger. She had known this moment would come eventually, but she wasn't ready to face it. As Mariana's tears fell, Luisa felt the world around her begin to crumble. Her mother knew too much, and the time to keep her secret was running out. Now she had to make a decision that would change the course of her life forever. After the tense conversation with her mother, Luisa finds herself at a crossroads. Mariana is getting closer to discovering the whole truth, and Luisa knows her options are running out. Meanwhile, Roberto begins to notice cracks within his family, but he still doesn't grasp the magnitude of the problem. The tension reaches new heights, and Luisa must make tough decisions as her world begins to fall apart. That night, after her mother confronted her, Luisa couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind running through the conversation with Mariana over and over. She knew she was losing control. Her mother wasn't going to stop investigating, and sooner or later, she would find out everything that Luisa had been hiding. How could she stop this? How could she keep her plan going without her entire world collapsing? Tired of overthinking, Luisa decided she needed to talk to Miguel. He always had a plan, a solution for every problem. She got out of bed, grabbed her phone, and stepped out into the garden to make the call. The cool night air briefly calmed her nerves as she dialed his number. Miguel answered on the third ring, his voice as nonchalant as ever. "Luisa? It's late. Is everything okay?" "No, Miguel. Everything is not okay. My mother knows too much. She's investigating the transactions. If she keeps digging, she's going to find everything." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Miguel spoke again, this time more serious. "You need to calm down. We knew this could happen. But she hasn't found everything yet, right?" "No, but she will. I don't know what to do. I can't stop her without raising more suspicion." Miguel sighed. "Listen, Luisa, we've come too far to throw it all away now. Your mother can't find out what you've done. If she does, it's over. You're going to have to act before she digs too deep." "Act? What do you mean?" "You have to distract her, get her away from the company, something to keep her occupied. If she stays involved in the family business, she'll discover everything. You need to buy yourself some time." Luisa remained silent, trying to process what Miguel was suggesting. Get her mother away from the business. But how? Mariana had always been involved in everything, and Roberto trusted her completely. But Miguel was right about one thing. If she didn't do something soon, everything would fall apart. All right, she finally responded. I'll do whatever it takes. The next morning, as Luisa had breakfast with her parents, she couldn't shake the knot in her stomach. She knew she had to start putting Miguel's plan into action, but she couldn't let her mother suspect what she was doing. She tried to act normal, even though anxiety was eating away at her from the inside. Luisa, are you staying late at the office today? Roberto asked while reading the newspaper. Yes, Dad. There are a few things I want to go over. Mariana, sitting silently on the other side of the table, observed her daughter. Since their conversation the night before, she hadn't stopped thinking about the suspicious transactions she had found. She knew Luisa was hiding something from her, but she didn't want to rush into anything. She didn't have all the answers yet. Luisa felt her mother's gaze on her and glanced down at her coffee cup, trying to appear calm. How about we have lunch together today, Mom? Luisa asked suddenly, trying to sound casual. Mariana raised an eyebrow, surprised by the suggestion. It wasn't usual for Luisa to propose such things. Lately, they had grown more distant. Lunch? Well, yes, sure. That sounds like a good idea. Luisa forced a smile. This was her chance to get her mother away from the office, at least for a while. Hours later, mother and daughter were seated at an elegant restaurant in the city center. Mariana was trying to enjoy the moment, but she couldn't ignore the growing worry inside her. Luisa had been restless throughout the entire meal, as if her mind was elsewhere, and that only reinforced Mariana's suspicions. Luisa, I know you told me everything is fine, but I can't stop feeling like you're hiding something from me. Luisa tensed, putting her utensils down. She knew she couldn't keep evading the issue, but she also couldn't reveal the truth. She decided to use Miguel's advice and steer the conversation in a different direction. Mom, I know you're worried, but everything really is fine. It's just, I've been feeling a bit overwhelmed with work. Sometimes I feel like the company is too much for me. Mariana looked at her daughter with compassion. Luisa, we've always wanted you to be involved in the company, but if you feel it's too much, we can find a solution. You don't have to do it all on your own. Luisa nodded, but she knew that wasn't enough. She needed a stronger excuse, something that would truly get her mother away from the business. She sat in silence for a moment, trying to find the right words. Maybe I should take some time off. Step away from the company for a while. I need to think, clear my head. Mariana looked at her, surprised. Are you sure? If that's what you need, of course, we can do that. But I never thought you'd feel this way. It's just temporary, Mom. I need a break, but I also need you to step back for a bit. If you're always there, I'll feel the pressure to come back right away. Mariana nodded slowly, though something about the suggestion made her uneasy. She knew Luisa was dealing with something, but she didn't understand why her daughter needed her to step back from the business as well. Still, she decided not to push any further. Maybe her daughter truly needed time for herself. That night, back at home, Luisa felt a small sense of relief. She had managed to plant the seed of doubt in her mother, and hopefully, she could buy herself some time to continue her plan. But she knew this was only temporary. Sooner or later, she would have to face the consequences of what she had done. Before going to bed, she received a message from Miguel. Well done. Just stay calm and keep moving forward. We're close to the end. Luisa sighed and turned off her phone. Even though she had managed to divert her mother's attention for now, she couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. She knew that the next step would be the hardest, and that there was no turning back. As darkness settled over the house, Luisa realized that her plan was at a critical stage. She had bought herself some time, but the truth always came out, and when it did, everything she had built could crumble. With the time Luisa has bought by distracting her mother, she feels the moment has come to make her final move. But as she sets her plan into motion, doubt and fear begin to creep in. Meanwhile, Mariana cannot remain at ease, and Roberto starts to realize that something much more serious is happening within his family. The inevitable confrontation is drawing closer. The days following her conversation with Mariana were a mixture of relief and growing anxiety for Luisa. She had successfully diverted her mother's attention, but she knew time was running out. The next phase of her plan required precision and speed. It was time for the final strike. If everything went well, She could escape with enough money to never worry about anything again. But if something went wrong, she would lose everything. One morning, sitting at her desk in the office, Luisa was reviewing the company's financial records once more. The amounts she had diverted so far were significant, but still not enough for Roberto or the auditors to detect. She had to make one last transfer, a large one that would secure her future without leaving a trace. She knew this was the riskiest thing she had ever done, but it was her only chance to walk away unscathed. Her phone vibrated. It was Miguel. "Luisa, are you ready?" he asked, his tone full of confidence, although he knew she was on the verge of breaking down. "Yes, but I don't know if we can pull this off, Miguel. This is too big. If my father finds out, he won't find out if you do exactly what I told you. Everything's under control." Luisa sighed, trying to calm herself. They had talked about this moment for months, and now that it was here, she wasn't sure if she had the strength to go through with it. She felt like the walls were closing in on her. Fear and guilt were beginning to eat away at her from the inside. "Trust me," Miguel insisted. "This is the final move. After this, we'll be free." Luisa closed her eyes for a moment, letting his words soothe her. Finally, she forced herself to continue. She opened her computer, logged into the company's bank accounts, and began preparing the transfer. She knew she was doing something unforgivable, but there was no turning back now. Meanwhile, at the Delgado family home, Mariana remained uneasy. Although she had agreed to step back from the business for a while, she couldn't stop thinking about the irregularities she had found in the financial reports. Something inside her told her to go back and check those documents again, despite what Luisa had said. That afternoon, while Roberto was in a meeting, Mariana decided to act. She knew her husband kept copies of all the financial reports in his office, so she went there, her heart pounding. Part of her didn't want to know the truth, but another part needed to uncover what was really going on. With trembling hands, she began to go through the files. She found the same report she had seen before, but this time, she paid more attention to the details. That's when she saw it. A series of recent transactions, much larger than the ones she had noticed before. The amounts were outrageous, and the destination of the money, it was an account she didn't recognize. Mariana felt panic rise within her. She knew something serious was happening, and she had a terrible suspicion about who was behind it all. Her daughter, the sweet girl she had raised, the one who now seemed like a stranger. How had it come to this? At that moment, she heard the front door open. It was Roberto, who had just returned from his meeting. Mariana quickly closed the files, trying to steady her breathing. She didn't know what to do. Should she tell Roberto what she had found? How could she explain what she suspected about their own daughter? Roberto walked into the office, and when he saw the expression on Mariana's face, he frowned. "What's wrong, Mariana? You look upset." Mariana looked him in the eye, feeling her heart break. She couldn't keep hiding what she had discovered. "Roberto, there's something you need to see." Back at the office, Luisa was finishing the transfer. Her hands trembled as she typed the final number, but she did it anyway. With a click, the money left the company's accounts and headed to its final destination, a secret offshore account. She had done it. She had completed the strike. But instead of feeling relief, a hollow emptiness began to settle over her. She closed her computer and leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of what she had just done. She knew she could never look at her family the same way again. Everything she had built with them, all the trust, had been destroyed in that moment. But it was the price she had decided to pay for her freedom. Suddenly, her phone rang. It was her mother. Luisa hesitated before answering. She knew she wasn't ready to talk to her, but something inside told her she had to pick up. "Hi, Mom. Luisa, I need you to come home right now. It's urgent." Mariana's voice sounded different, firmer, more determined. A chill ran down Luisa's spine. "What's wrong? Is everything okay?"
No, it's not. Come home. Now.
When Luisa arrived home, the atmosphere was tense. Roberto and Mariana were waiting for her in the living room, both with serious expressions. Luisa felt her knees weaken at the sight of them. She knew the moment she had dreaded had arrived. Mariana was the first to speak. "Luisa, We found the reports. We know what you've been doing." Luisa's world stopped. Her breathing became shallow as she tried to think of an excuse, a lie that could save her. But she knew there was no way out. "How could you do this to us?" Roberto asked, his voice filled with disappointment and pain. Luisa opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Everything she had built over the past few months was crumbling before her eyes. With her secret exposed and her family shattered, Luisa realizes there is no turning back. The end of her betrayal is near, and she must face the consequences of her actions. Will she be able to salvage anything from the life she once had? After the confrontation at home, Luisa faces the consequences of her actions. Her betrayal has been exposed, and her relationship with her parents is shattered. Roberto, Mariana, and Luisa must confront the reality of what has happened as the once solid pieces of their family crumble. The truth is out, and each must decide how to live with it. Luisa sat on the couch, staring at the floor, unable to lift her gaze to meet her parents' eyes. The silence in the room was suffocating, as if the air itself had been thickened by the tension and pain floating between them. Her mother, Mariana, sat across from her, tears welling in her eyes, barely holding them back. Beside her, Roberto wore an expression of impenetrable hardness. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes showed a disappointment that Luisa couldn't bear. "How could you do this to us?" Roberto finally broke the silence, his voice low but filled with deep sorrow. "Everything we did was for you, to give you a future. I never thought you'd do something like this." Roberto's words were like knives in Luisa's heart. She felt the weight of her betrayal crushing her, but she couldn't find the words to explain her actions. How could she justify the unjustifiable? "I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "Saying you don't know isn't enough," Roberto replied, rising from his chair and pacing back and forth. "You stole from us. Not the company, Luisa. You stole from us. Your family. And the worst part is that you've destroyed the trust we had in you." Mariana, who had been silent until then, wiped a tear from her cheek and spoke, her voice trembling with hurt. "We gave you everything, Luisa. Why couldn't you trust us? What drove you to do this?" Luisa finally looked up, seeing the suffering etched into her parents' faces. She knew that nothing she said could undo the damage she had caused, but she felt she had to try. "I don't know when it all changed," she said, her voice breaking. "I felt like I had no control over my life, that I was always living in Dad's shadow, waiting for him to give me the place I deserved in the company. Miguel made me believe I could have it all if I took control myself, but I didn't know it would go this far. I didn't know I would lose you both." Mariana closed her eyes, as if her daughter's words were too painful to bear. Roberto stopped pacing and stood still, staring at Luisa with a mixture of anger and sadness. "Miguel," he muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. "He convinced you to betray us, didn't he?" Luisa nodded, unable to speak. She knew blaming Miguel wouldn't absolve her of her guilt, but it was the truth. He had been the catalyst, though in the end, the decision had been hers. "I can't believe you fell for his lies," Roberto continued. "But that doesn't justify what you did. We always thought you could handle more responsibility, but we wanted to make sure you were ready. We couldn't give you everything all at once. But instead of waiting, you decided to take it. And that, Luisa, is something I don't know if we can ever forgive." Roberto's words hit Luisa with full force. Forgiveness. She knew her relationship with her parents was broken, but hearing that they might never be able to forgive her felt like a punch to the gut. She knew she had made terrible mistakes, but until that moment, she hadn't fully grasped the magnitude of her betrayal. "I'm sorry," she finally said, tears filling her eyes. "I know I can't fix what I did, but I'm willing to face the consequences. I'll do whatever it takes to try and earn back your trust, even though I know it will be hard." Mariana moved closer to Luisa, sitting beside her on the couch. She looked at her daughter with both tenderness and pain, as only a mother could. "Luisa, what hurts me the most isn't the money. It's that you hid all of this from us. You didn't trust us enough to tell us what you were going through. I can't understand how we got here." "I don't understand it either," Luisa replied, her voice shaking. I don't know when I lost my way. As tears rolled down Luisa's face, Roberto approached slowly. For a few seconds, he just looked at his daughter, as if searching for some trace of the girl he had raised, now replaced by someone he barely recognized. I don't know what happens next, Roberto said, his voice broken by sadness. But what I do know is that nothing will ever be the same again. The words hung in the air, filled with the certainty that the family that had once been strong and united was now broken in a way that might never fully be repaired. Mariana squeezed Luisa's hand tightly as Roberto walked away, leaving the two women alone in the room. "Mom, please tell me that one day you'll be able to forgive me," Luisa whispered, unable to meet her mother's gaze. Mariana, with tears in her eyes, took a deep breath before responding. "Forgiveness isn't something that can happen overnight, Luisa. This is going to take time. Time to heal. Time to rebuild what's been broken. But what matters most to me right now is that you understand what you've done and that you're willing to change. If you truly want to regain what you've lost, it will be a long road. But I'm not saying it's impossible." Luisa nodded, her heart filled with regret and remorse. She knew that the road to forgiveness would be difficult, but she also knew that she would do everything in her power to try to mend the damage she had caused. Because in the end, even though she had chased after power and money, all she truly wanted now was to regain her family. That night, as silence filled the house, Luisa sat alone in her room, reflecting on everything that had happened. She had lost so much in her pursuit of something that, in the end, had no value compared to the love and trust of her family. She knew she couldn't turn back time, but she had the chance to try to make things right. Luisa's betrayal had changed everything. The Delgado family would never be the same, but there was a small chance to rebuild what had been destroyed. Luisa now had to face the consequences of her actions, but with the hope that, in time, she might find a way to redeem herself.